Hey, Michelle Foss, president of Green Bellevue. We are here at College Heights Park to continue our invasive species tour. I'm actually starting out with the native species, but as I mentioned earlier, invasives often mimic natives. So this right here is a native plant called poison hemlock. Poison hemlock also looks very similar to Queen Anne's lace, which is invasive. It's used in floral arrangements. However, poison hemlock is called poison hemlock for a reason. It causes severe burns to human skin, and it's poison. So don't touch and don't eat it if you can help it. Queen Anne's lace, you can pull and do things with, which is why it's in flower arrangements. So poison hemlock, this one is the native. Queen Anne's lace is the one that is invasive. So recap, there are three main classifications of plants when it comes to invasives. You have invasive, or it causes damage to the system or the economics. Non-native, non-invasive, that just means it's introduced and not native to the system. And then native, that means that it has been here from pre-settlement times. So before European settlement, that was a plant that lived here. Many of our invasives have been brought over from other continents, either through settlement or accidentally importing seeds through trade and shipping. So right over here, there is a yellow plant. This is called field mustard. It is not necessarily invasive, but it is not native to this system. Like most mustard plants, it produces hundreds of thousands of seeds, but they only germinate in extremely open conditions where there aren't other plants. So you often don't find this in areas that have healthy plant communities. So you'll see it around here where there's some waste areas here at College Heights Park. Now, most of the grass that you see here is invasive grown or a tree canary grass, both of which, as you can see, will take over an area and it shades out the plants underneath it. In addition to growing up and shading out the plants, it can create a thatch layer, which prevents the seeds from getting down into the soil. So this is an area that you might find more invasives and fewer natives because of the lack of access to the soil. We call this space in between plants where soil is available for seeds interstitial space. And you need some of that in order for plants to regrow and to germinate seeds, but you don't want too much or you end up with weeds, basically. So here we have the hen bit again. And a whole lot of poison hemlock. We also have burdock, which is not always considered invasive. You have the big tall one here, but it likes to grow in waste sites. It's relatively easily outcompeted in healthy areas. So this is a fun one. This is Kentucky bluegrass or yard grass, and it's actually considered invasive at Fontenelle Forest. What happens is it'll get in from people's yards and it will form sod, which is not the type of soil we want growing in the forest. Because it creates a thick mat, it doesn't allow for other seeds to get in and reach the soil. It also depletes the soil of nutrients, making it harder for other things to grow. So eventually it ends up killing itself by depleting all the nutrients of the soil, which then just brings in more invasives. All right, we are going to follow this deer trail. Okay, what's this invasive? Honeysuckle. We actually have two species of invasive honeysuckle. Most commonly is the amber honeysuckle. We also have a Tatarian honeysuckle. The leaves are slightly more elongate and they have orange berries instead of red. We actually see that up north more often than down here. Oh, this is exciting. I mean, not really because it's invasive, but in the first program, I talked about how garlic mustard is a biennial or two-year growth plant. These are the rosettes of garlic mustard. So these are first-year garlic mustard plants. This right here is another weed called lamb's quarters. Technically, it's native, but most people don't want it in their yards.
However, it is very nutritious.
Yes, it is. It is. Okay, watch the rocks over here. All right. This is a very difficult spot to see the floodplain, so we're gonna maybe go back to the first place I said that wasn't the right spot to talk about some of the floodplain invasives we have. So, actually, we can talk about this real quick. If you look, there's a lot of rocks and concrete here, and this is erosion control. It helps to keep the soil from completely washing away. What you'll see is that it's taken over primarily by invasives because there's nothing else growing there, and they've taken advantage of that. There are some other trees and things growing on this slope that are native, but some of the invasives got here first and took over. Boy, there's so much honeysuckle. So there's also, as much as I hate to admit it, a danger in cutting all of this honeysuckle because they do provide some slope stabilization. So if all of the slope honeysuckle was cut and nothing was there to replace it, you could lose all that soil. So here is everybody's favorite plant, poison ivy. In the first program, whoops, not there, sorry, right here.
Sorry.
In the first program, I showed you the vine growth habit. This is a ground cover habit. So poison ivy grows three different ways. It grows as a vine, it can grow as a shrub, and it can grow as a ground cover plant. Here you see the classic leaves of three, let it be. You've got a mitten for each corner. And then in the middle, you've got a mitten with two thumbs right there and right there. So that is how you identify poison ivy. Again, native and a great food source and even nesting source for other animals. The only types of animals that the oil irritates are primates. Nobody's wearing shorts, right? Okay, good. So as we walk back to our wetlands viewing spot, I want to share with you a couple of apps and websites to identify plants, because the first step to getting rid of invasives is identifying them. One of my favorites for plants that I have no clue what they are is called Inaturalist. An Inaturalist allows you to take a picture or describe a plant, upload it, and you can make notes.
As best I can.
And explain what it is. And then you can press on the what did I see, and it will give you suggestions for what they think that plant is. Another good source, if you think you know what it is to look it up in the USDA Plants Guide. That way, if you know what the plant is, but don't know if it's invasive, it will tell you if it's invasive in a given county. Now, remember, that's federally invasive, not necessarily location-specific invasive. So plants.sc.egov.usda.gov. And this is a database of almost all of the plants that you can find in the United States. Just remember that this is an agricultural site, so it may not tell you that certain plants are actually invasive. For instance, Dame's Rocket, which got mowed, so I can't show you the flowers, is not technically invasive, and it's still included in some wildflower seed packets. So when you go to create a pollinator garden or you're trying to plant native, don't go with a generic wildflower mix unless you can see what the species are in that mix. Chances are you could have invasives. Also, introducing plants from other areas of the country could create an invasive problem as well. That's one of the reasons why we push for planting native. That way you know what you're planting can live in harmony with the natural system. So one of the hallmarks of the area we live here in Bellevue on the slopes of the Missouri River is the Bur Oak Tree. So that is a keystone species to our system. And that is a tree whose associated plant is the most biodiverse habitat in the Missouri Hills. Oh, that's exciting. So I believe this is Sullivan seal, which is a native woodland plant. So this is a Bur Oak Tree. It has your classic oak leaf shape with lobes on it. Our other commonly found oak tree here is the red oak, which has, it still has some lobes, but the lobes have tips on them. Their bark also looks different. So this tree and its associates can support over 900 different types of animals and plants and fungal communities. So when we have invasives come in, even native trees that shouldn't be in an oak system, you start seeing a reduction in that biodiversity. You start losing plants, you lose insects, you lose the fungal community, and then it's easier for more invasives to come in and degrade it even further. So it's a cycle that keeps getting worse and worse. It also makes the trees and the native plants more susceptible to diseases and deformities. This is a gall of some sort. So those are some ways that invasives can take a system and start degrading it. Depletes nutrients from the soil, it prevents other plants from growing, and then it makes it harder for the native plants to grow, just introducing more species of invasives. Oh. So the cottonwood tree is actually another fantastic native tree. And you don't often find oaks and cottonwoods together, except right at the edge of the river. So this cottonwood seed probably was dropped here 7,500 years or so ago. And it had just enough sunlight to keep growing. And it's in a wet enough area, because the river is right below, that there was plenty of seed source. Cottonwoods are cool because when you have a lot of them, their leaves hitting together sounds like running water. And some of the pioneers would listen for that sound, for the rushing water, to find areas of water that they could get for drinking. I believe that's all. The false fold. So it's already flowered. Oh, maybe not. Maybe those are the buds. So such a cool plant. Okay. So I am not a gardener. I am a habitat manager. So primarily what I do is get rid of the things that shouldn't be there in order to promote the native growth. So I rely heavily on sources like the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum plant list, and I believe Bellevue University is coming up with the native plant list as well. There are a couple of other local nurseries, local-ish, like Midwest native plants and Prairie Plains Institute, who also have plant lists. Now, depending on what type of soil you have and what type of area you live in, there are different plants that you'd want to plant. Full shade, partial shade, full sun, wetland, that kind of a thing. So knowing what type of area you have that you need to replace invasives, that will determine what type of plants you need to plant. Oh, this is actually another example of not necessarily native, but non-invasive. So ground clover, there's red and white varieties, are pretty common. They're weeds. People don't like them in their yards. However, they are beneficial plants that don't hurt anything. They also could be easily outcompeted if the soil is good. They are fantastic for eating as well, both for wildlife and people. So I actually have a pancake recipe for clover flowers.
Aren't they nitrogen fixants? Don't they bring
Yes.
nitrogen to help improve the soil?
Yes, so they will actually end up working themselves out of an area because they do improve the soil, which makes it more likely that some of the native plants can grow quickly too. They are not super highly adapted and don't necessarily outcompete some of the natives, but if they're in a yard, they have plenty of room to grow. Here we go. So we are actually on a cliffside here overlooking Fontenelle Forest. That's the Fontenelle floodplain out there. And this is we're actually getting close to the end, aren't we? So the wetlands at Fontenelle Forest are one of the remaining intact wetlands along the Missouri River that is big enough to do any good. So in the 2019 flood, this area was under quite a bit of water for a really long time. That's good and bad. Floods act as a reset button, so it can kill a lot of the non-natives, but it can also bring in new ones. The problem with the 2019 flood was the timing. It was a dormant season flood, so it didn't really affect a lot of the plant communities. So we did see introduction of invasives, but we didn't see the kill off of any of the other plants. So we have a lot more reed canary grass. We also have introduced Japanese hopvine. There are also a lot of flowering plants down there that are invasive. Some are garden plants like purple loosestrife, and some have just come down the river like cutleaf teasel. And like any habitat, when it's invaded or degraded, even your backyard, you have a loss of wildlife and a loss of biodiversity. So one of the things that we try to do is determine what's there, what should be there, and what shouldn't be there. And then you make a plan to have that happen. The same process can be applied in your yard. Determine what's there, what should be there, what shouldn't be there, get rid of what shouldn't, and plant more of what should. Do we have any questions yet? I forgot to ask in the first one. Okay. Another local resource for plants is Fontenelle Forest Nature Search. And this is kind of a cool place to go because it's not just plants, but it's plants and animals that you could find at Fontenelle Forest in Neil Woods. So it's extremely localized to this area. So there's also some fungus and slime molds. So if you're ever curious what's been found at Fontenelle Forest, this is a good chunk of it. We do have other things that are not in Nature Search that we have found based on some of our surveys, and we're finding new things all the time. So we do try to add when we find new things, but this is a great way to check to see if what you thought you saw, you actually did. And the web address for that is ffnaturesearch.org, ffnaturesearch.org. And I can show you the statewide arboretum site. And that is plantnebraska.org. So most of what I talked about so far today have been invasive plants, and that's because that's what I tend to work with. However, there are invasive species in every living thing, including viruses and bacteria. And there's a site for that too. There's actually a Nebraska invasive species site. neinvasives.com. So you've probably heard of the emerald ash borer, which is an invasive species. There's also Asian beetles. They look like ladybugs, but they're invasive. There has now been a worm that has been found in the Bellevue area that is also invasive, and it's kind of ridiculous. It jumps. So they outcompete the other worms, and they also decimate some of the plants. So invasive plants are what we tend to focus on because we work at a habitat level at Fontenelle Forest, but every invasive can cause issues. By the time you get to the point where the emerald ash borer is in a location, it's too late. Some of the treatments can prolong the life of trees, but it doesn't necessarily prevent the spread of the invasive, and it doesn't necessarily keep the tree from dying. So one way you can prevent really bad effects of invasives is to have that biodiversity. When you have a lot of different types of trees, even if you lose 90% of the ash trees, you're not losing 90% of your canopy. You're only losing some. So one of the things that as a community we need to work on is increasing our biodiversity, removing invasives, making sure that the natives have a leg up especially on the ones that are more adapted and leaf out earlier, stay leafed out longer, and produce more seeds. So those are all some bigger ways to handle invasives. In your yard, pull the Dame's rocket, pull the garlic mustard. Even better, use it. Don't just throw it away. With both Dame's rocket and garlic mustard, a lot of flowering plants, even if you pull them, that's not good enough. They could still go to seed, and they could just drop the seeds where they're dropped. So you have to either throw them away or eat them. Both of those plants are in the mustard family. The entire plant is edible. So try to see what else you can do with invasives. Another common yard invasive is Japanese barberry. It makes a fantastic shrub hedge. It is horribly invasive. They form colonies and they are prolific seeders. So they're really difficult to get rid of. There's been a couple places in Fontenelle Forest where we've had to go in with brush cutters and you just cut them off. That's all you can do. They don't require herbicide because they do not resprout. Honeysuckle and Tree of Heaven both we use herbicide on because they resprout. So instead of just continuously cutting them for 30 or 40 years, you cut them, you paint that little bit of herbicide, and they're less likely to grow back. One of the other problems with most invasives is that their seeds live for a very, very long time in the soil. So you have to treat them for a very, very long time. It's not you get rid of them once and you're good. You have to keep going. Are there any questions? Okay. Yep. So the code, again, for this passport activity is not native, all one word, all lowercase.
I will put it in the chat. Says thank you so much.
So if there aren't any other questions, or if you guys don't have anything else that I missed or that you'd like to add, we can go ahead and end the program. All right, huge thank you, Baden, for coming out and videoing. Dawn and Tom, thanks for coming so I wasn't talking to myself. Thank you for joining us live, and thank you to all those who are going to watch the recording.